The next session here is looking at where we should or should not go relative to the next iteration, and you may tell us there shouldn't be one, of research in and around the EFRI system. We have just completed the first iteration, the first 10-year iteration, and as we heard earlier from Jordy, they have set themselves a new strategic plan for the next decade. What part, if any, should we be looking at in terms of new research to hopefully enhance this EFRI initiative number 2? We're going to ask Jordy and Ian Sinclair to come up, and they're going to facilitate this next session. But before we do that, I just want to make note of the fact that we have with us here today the manager of the EFRI section for the last, God, Joe, at least 25 years. And he's leaving us collectively in 3 weeks' time and going to go into ballroom dancing and drinking red wine. I think we owe you a hand because you've done an awful lot of work over that period of time, and I know it's been frustrating, but anyhow, Joe, thank you. So, Jordy? And the guys are going to come up here and soft shoe it around these microphones. You're on.
Okay. So one of the things I wanted to, it's been a really interesting session to see some of the results coming out of round 1 of the R&D programs. I did want to kind of speak to a couple things that came out of yesterday that I was thinking along the way. And with, as an example of the attribute list and that kind of thing. So in 2006, we took stocking out of the FRI. And then by 2010, we had to reinsert it. And one of the issues is the development of the Forest Management Planning Manual and the associated tech specs don't really line up with our cycle that well. So once we make decisions on attribute lists, it has to be reflected in the manuals. So we end up having to make sure that we're in accordance with what the manuals are doing. And when we did that attribute review this past November and December, and then we had a VOR contract meeting at the end of February and March, and beginning of March, the FMPM and all the tech specs were due by the end of March. So they had already gone through all the draft revisions and development. So really to move a lot of those attributes in and out that we had had discussions on really wasn't going to be able to work that well, because then we were going to be stuck with a list of attributes that didn't reflect the forest management planning requirement. So that's kind of one answer. And then the other comment is with the inventory assessment plots, we're also using a BAF4. We make a decision as a BAF4 or BAF2, and again for the same reason, to try to minimize the amount of measurements. Because in those plots we're doing full diameter and full measurement on 4 of the 9 plots within our cluster. So that's kind of why we allowed for the BAF4, is in order to minimize measurement error and measurement bias from the crews. We feel it's important to have the diameters and the heights associated with species because we get form factor, we get a lot of other metrics that we don't traditionally collect within our calibration plots, but you got to keep the measurement amount as manageable as possible. And BAF4 has been used in the province, and we didn't want to go to BAF7 and 9s and other things that potentially could be used in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence. So one of the things that we wanted to try and do is, because we have our strategic direction that we need to post and get out there to everybody, we got to make sure we're AODA compliant before we do that, because we're in greens, and greens are terrible colors. So it's got to be gray and black and cleaned up. And probably the formatting needs to be cleaned up a little bit for other formats. But one of the things we wanted to do is we wanted to kind of reinforce that any R&D projects that we do, we're going to need to evaluate them against a strategic direction. So I think the breadth of projects that we've had this round with trying to tie it to wildlife have been fantastic, because it's one of the focus areas in that, can't read it, but the bottom one, so number 6, the inventory is scalable, construction scalable and adaptable to allow it to be used across the province. So one of the things that we, sure. So one of the things we, okay, sorry. So we want to make sure that the FRI is being used, because it's a large investment for the province. We want to make sure that it's used as broadly as possible. And that's one of our main goals. So with the R&D projects to be spread out, to make that piece more accessible is fantastic. We think like some of our own ideas are a communications plan would be good. Within the ministry, we're pretty limited on social media. Ontario Wood has a good social media presence. FRI has no social media presence. And I don't know if we really want one, but nonetheless, it's still kind of a piece of a communications plan. Again, part of that communications plan too is we've offloaded a lot of communications pieces to our vendors. So through the vendor record, we require that vendor to gain access to private land, Indigenous lands, traditional lands, parks, and the amount of time investment that goes into that to develop access and to get permissions to go to those areas is significant. And it's not really structured within their dollar amounts that they bid. So some strategies on how to help us make that process better and easier and more inclusive would be an example of part of what the communications plans kind of are that we're looking for. I wrote down a couple of other ideas, but that's kind of the breadth of things that we're looking for. It's not just a matter of like making our attributes better. That's certainly going to be part of it. I think when we go to attribute review, there's still some merit into looking at what we do in the Boreal and what we do in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence. With the assessment plot procedure, like we sample at the provincial forest type, but provincial forest type in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence is not really a meaningful aggregate to measure at. But in the same boat as standard forest unit, too refined for us, in that maybe our plot densities go up to 500 to 600 plots per management unit as an assessment procedure, which is likely more than we can afford to do. So those are some examples of things that we'd like to see, and they're just two kind of broad things. Most of that kind of development falls to Ian and myself and some others, and it's a lot of work. So any help that we can get would be fantastic. Additionally, with those goals are kind of our measures on how we're going to do individually. They're going to form the basis of our operational plan and our own work planning within our section. And again, some of them are fairly easy to evaluate, but others are not. And they're difficult in the sense that an outside observation or evaluation criteria being developed might be an acceptable piece. the jurisdictional review, things like that might be an interesting way to tackle some of that stuff. So we're not necessarily looking for, you know, core traditional R&D around attributes. It might be a broader spectrum of projects that we'd like to look at. Okay.
Well,
Okay.
I think you covered off. I think we covered off a pretty good introduction to the strategic plan. The next kind of section we'd like to move towards is opening up the floor for some discussion. So if there are any questions or discussion points that we'd like to start off with, if you can raise your hand, we'll have a microphone that'll move around the floor. So we'll move on to that piece.
Is the strategic plan available? How do we get it? How do we get our own copy so we can?
We have to go through the approval process, but it will be made available on the, I believe we can post it onto the FFT website. Yeah.
Yeah, so we can post to the FFT website.
Okay.
We can give you a copy of it now if you want. Like, I have a digital copy of it, so.
Well, just, I mean, if we want to think about how to build proposals that fit with the strategic direction, I understand about the approval process for, you know, publishing it more broadly, but I think there's a lot of great minds in here that would use that effectively to help fit with your strategic objectives.
Yeah, and I guess that's something too to talk about. Like, so we've done a full day workshop on summary of the R&D projects that we did under round one. And I think from my perspective, it's been very interesting to see the results of all of those projects. So the question ends up being is, are these R&D opportunities something to continue? Is certainly a question. I know our industrial partners on the advisory committee have acknowledged that they want to integrate all of the R&D as much as they can. And I think that means we have great support from the industry, we have great support from the advisory committee, which is Forest Industry Division, Forest Policy Division, and Provincial Services Division representation at that. So we have support from high level, you know, our directorship and the industry, high level industry, to continue with the R&D projects. So I guess that's part of my question too, is do you guys see more opportunity to do that? Like we only did one call, one formal call. Is it better to do multiple formal calls at smaller amounts, or like, kind of open to, I'm not sure the trust is open to that, but from our perspective, like, we did it late in the cycle, when maybe it might have been nicer to do it at a different time in the cycle, maybe midpoint of the cycle, and then we could start to integrate the research, the findings from the R&D projects into the start of this cycle. Like, we're kind of stuck now a little bit. It'll be a couple years in that we'll be able to make some serious modifications to some procedures, but.
I just have an idea for the assessment side of things. It's not necessarily R&D, but 2 points. The first is that, have you guys considered assigning each photo interpreter some sort of a unique ID number? I almost think like a license plate, because what happens is they move around between companies. So if you had a company that didn't perform well, the company is no longer a vendor, but their interpreters moved to another company, so you haven't really solved the problem. And the other is not as a punitive measure, but as a way of, we all know different interpreters have different biases. Some will call heights high, some will call it low. If we had a record of who did the interp, we could over time improve the inventory by systematically correcting problems. And to that point, if we had a forum where end users could report saying, this number interpreter is consistently calling things low or consistently confusing these two species, we could crowdsource the information at a low cost and overall improve the product. And we also have other plot networks out there to use as an assessment tool. the NFI, the PGPs, the PSPs, if we leverage all of that as an assessment, we don't need to go out and do new data collection. We already have the data. Just apply it to do basic things like species checks. The one example I love showing my class, and this is not a shot at the FRI, it's just is a challenge, is our Hogarth plantation has a ton of different plots and it's pure jack pine in the new FRI. And it's just one of those examples that we've got supplemental data and plot networks that would have corrected that problem very rapidly.
And the Hogarth is red pine, by the way. But we've been at it for 10 years. Considering the primary end user of this for the next iteration of research and development, I think we owe it to industry to maybe listen to first this time. So industry knows, I believe, where the gaps are, where the difficulties are. So I think we owe it to industry this time to let them in an early workshop of some sort, including the 8 vendors of record, to highlight where the real holes are in what we need. So we end up in another 10 years of, research is great, but this time don't ask the researchers first. Ask industry first where the gaps are. That's my suggestion.
So, speak to Alex. We can back engineer that. Yeah.
We've done it. We can look at some inventories and say that these problems occur. And there's also simple checks. Another example that is a simple challenge is just checking, do the species in the list make sense? The English River had tulip tree and hemlock. Those sorts of simple, really simple queries don't appear to, I don't know if they're just being missed or, it's a huge problem and it's a big inventory, but that's another challenge that we've come up with. So can we go through and fix that? And I'm sure it's just a data entry error. It's hitting the wrong number. So
Could be climate change.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I know with the assessment plots, like, I think we were hoping to get some more information related out of that program to be able to do that. We had some initial discussions to look at, like, basically we decided our plot network and our sample size would be based on the BA variability within the calibration plots by PFT. And we tried to stay out of individual interpreter, individual company, that kind of thing, like, just because we really wanted it to just be an assessment of the attributes that make up the volume prediction. But again, that could be something that could be looked at in terms of how that affects the sample size. You know what I mean? Like, we have X number of dollars to do assessment. So that could be part of the assessment. The other thing I was thinking about yesterday was Kara with the random forest idea is maybe that's a form of assessment that we could do. So we do species composition based on random forest, and then we look for what Colin indicated is those V flags, and you start to stratify out how you want to make those assessments. And that could be another way to build some variance around what the attributes are.
I just want to address this thing of stem density, this issue of stem density. We had a great presentation about stocking. And working in Ontario and Western Canada as a humble interpreter, I use stems per hectare in Western Canada, and I know that stems per hectare is more intuitive as an interpreter. You can use it on different layers, right? Top and bottom canopy layer. And I guess my question would be, how do you defend stocking, I guess, in the light of something like stems per hectare, where you can still interpret stems per hectare and you can still get your stocking when you match it to your normal basal area. And so, but if the interpreters were able to interpret that.
Yeah, I was thinking that too in that presentation is one of the problems that comes out with this whole stocking thing is traditionally we don't photo interp greater than 1, and often if we have a choice, I'll speak strictly for me. I can measure height. I'll measure my height on the imagery, and then I use the site index tables to help guide ages if I don't have supplementary data for ages. So if I have a plot network around, then I can start to infer what the ages are based on disturbance patterns and stuff, right? But what ends up happening when we're looking at plots and using the stocking values coming out of the calibration plots is if I'm in a poplar stand, pop in the normal basal area stands are all from pure measurements, all determined by pure pop. Now, if I'm in a poplar 3, SB 2, jack pine 2, white pine, and birch, I have to pull my stocking value from the normal table of poplar. So if that's 40 square meters per hectare, and I've got all of this other stuff within there, it's not a 40 stems, 40 BA pop stand that I'm comparing it to. I'm comparing it to some spruce budworm demolished stand. It isn't represented by that BA, but I don't have any other BA. So I can see that we're going to have a difference between what you photo interpret because you're kind of leaning on that pop lead, and in the field you're measuring all the stems that end up being in the plot. So I can see that discrepancy, but I also think that if we go down the path of having a DTM or having a LiDAR or whatever based DEM, then we can calculate canopy height model. We'll have all the heights. We'll be able to do a BA measurement, a stems per hectare measurement based on wherever we want to be within that polygon. So really stocking still has to maintain the header in the table because it's a requirement of forest management planning in Ontario. How we define that within the tech spec can change. So we can rewrite that in the 2017 tech spec to say that stocking, if it's a photo interp value, is done this way. If it's an analysis package and you want to do BA, this is how it's represented. If it's a stems per hectare thing, this is how it's represented. So that may be something that it'll take cooperation by a number of units in order to get that kind of thing to stay, but in terms of the header for the column, it'll still have to be stocking.
It has to stay there.
Yeah.
So you're thinking you might automate the stems per hectare? Is that what I heard? You might automate the...
Yeah, I think you could. But it has to be, if you do automate it, then you have to define what the automation piece is and what that number represents. It can still have the same column heading, it just has to have the definition that reflects how you did it.
Okay.
It would be nice to hear some... would be helpful, certainly for us also, to get some feedback to that idea that came up a little earlier in regards to a workshop or something for the industry players and the companies involved with actually doing the interp. Any thoughts on that idea?
I think we do it.
Yeah. Show of hands.
Yeah.
Do you want to do a show of hands as to whether or not that's a great idea to move forward on? If there's no comments? Okay. Yeah.
So I guess the other comment is, like I come to the R&D table with my own biases on what I want my workload to get decreased by. So so like communication stuff, like, again, that it's not necessarily going to be an industry thing, but we've tried to implement some changes to how we communicate. I had a slide yesterday showing some dashboarding and stuff, and that's been comments that we've got from industry, is that they would like to see that stuff. They don't necessarily want, like, if a photo project manager has like 5 units on the go, 5 summaries at the end of the month, and 5 status reports and live updates is basically 3 weeks of the work. And really, that's not the focus that we necessarily, there's software that can automate that stuff for us if we standardize the inflow and outflow of materials. So, and then we can keep focused on the audit pieces, which I think is, well, that's our mandated role. So I think from that perspective, like, you can see a theme here for me. Communications and those strategies are really, really important. And we've implemented the post-inventory meeting, and you know what, they've been really good for us to do. It's excellent to find out what the focus on the review of the attributes is, because that changes how we start to evaluate the inventories as they're coming in, and what types of attributes and the combination of attributes that are important to the end user. And it's good for us to share like how we've generated those attributes, 2-tier conditions, and how polytypes have changed, and where their PF went, and things like that. So it's been really good. But in the same boat, there's likely opportunities for a pre-inventory meeting to change a little bit. Those can be formal exchanges of data, we've had suggestions to sit down with the SFL holder and really go over dev type assignments in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence, and how important it is to integrate that dev stage back in. Like, I know with on the Green Mantle, originally we didn't have the planning inventory. We didn't disperse that planning inventory to the contractor. We didn't really understand the importance of the work in 2007 to assign all the dev stages for the planning composite. So it didn't necessarily make it, the importance of that information didn't really filter down properly through a pre-inventory meeting. And I think if we change the tone of those things and change the objectives of how those meetings go, then I think we can kind of mitigate some of the issues along the way that have occurred. And again, for us too, this is another selfish one for us, is when we're looking for staff, I think everyone's has to deal with retirements and trying to attract qualified people to get into the programs. Some of the communications pieces are probably important. We might need a different way to reach out to people to try and get them into the programs. So again, I think the change of how we disperse the info, instead of just doing these, strategic plans and posting them on the FFT website, a lot of people don't necessarily know to go there. I don't even think the universities or colleges in anywhere other than Sault Ste. Marie and Trent and Lakehead really know to do that. So might be a good way. Anyway, it's a thought anyway.
Jordan? I just wonder what the thinking is for these next inventories. So we've just worked with this first generation and just spent the better part of a year correcting it in places. So how do we make sure that we don't alienate that work that's just been done? And next time round find that we're sort of revisiting areas we've already visited already?
Yeah, well, I think that's kind of my comment on the pre-inventory meeting, is that we don't go to Leo necessarily to pull the T1, the final T1. I think we'll have to pull from the planning composite that went at time 0, and then we have to take that one forward. So, and then through that process that you guys have had to make alterations from the FRI to get to the PCI and then that OPI, then we have to be aware of, like, we're going to have to sit down formally and just make sure that we don't do that. And that's why I think that communications plan and that formalized piece is kind of the way we're going to have to do it. Go for it.
So calibration seemed to be a big theme throughout a lot of the projects that the trust has funded. Yet I'm curious, I like to think I'm a little bit more informed than most, given coming at this from a growth and yield perspective, but I still struggle with the amount of, or having enough information about the calibration exercises that FRI goes through internally. So you got PFAPs, you got PFIGUPs, you got the NFI grid network, we got PSPs, we got PGPs, as Alex referred to. There's lots of on-the-ground information, and it would be nice to get that described or articulated in a way as to where we know where you're at internally when it comes to your own ground truth network or protocols. It seems like that was not mentioned at all throughout the process of how either the cruise lines or the PFAP work or the assessment plots or the PFIGUP work has been done, the photo plots. So I think there's a few pieces missing that could bring some, use this credibility. I mean, it is what it is. It's an interpreted product, right? But if you show then that these plot networks exist, this is where we can complement, this is where we can get together and use more information. These are the gaps in FRI conditions that we have very little information for. These are a little bit more of a focus of where we need to get more information. I think if that was made available to people, myself, I'm not always in the know as to how much work is being done, where we're at with calibration, where we're at with the FIGUPs, the long-term vision to get ground truth information to calibrate this product. So there's more of a suggestion, I guess, for more of that information to bring validity to the process that you guys go through, right?
Yeah. I'll go back. It sounds like communications. So yeah, I think that there's certainly a gap there, and I think it does state, like in terms of I think everyone recognizes the commitment the province has made to the monitoring programs that it has. So I think here, I don't know, it's the fifth one down. So it's remeasure and all permanent forest inventory photo plots and ground plot plots. That one. So there's still a commitment to try and maintain those monitoring networks. The reason they were established is to make sure that we added some vigor to our calibration plots that are, biasly located or located based on access or conditions that we want to sample. The PFIGUP is, on the NFI grid. But like we kind of mentioned too yesterday, that might be another opportunity to look for some cost savings, but some R&D opportunities is a plot design that integrates into some of the existing monitoring plot networks. Maybe a change in how we distribute that plot network and how we make those data sets available. Might be something to try and look at. Like I know you guys are doing SQL. If we look at a cloud, I say it goes to an Oracle database, then we got to suck in all the SQL stuff, or we got to suck the Oracle stuff somewhere else, or whatever it is, right? So that's, I think part of the, it's part of the program is we want to make the data accessible, we want to make it usable, we want to make sure that everybody has access to it and it's easily accessed. Like one of the comments we've heard is we want it to kind of be like iTunes in that really I just want to type in Wabigoon and I get the Wabigoon and I get everything related to the Wabigoon within the Wabigoon boundary. If I want something surrounding it, then I say, well, give me the crossroute and the Dryden, and I get it. So that's kind of the hope where we want to try and go with it. And I think through that process, the more and more we use it, the more and more we'll make it better. Yeah.
On that delivery side there, actually, is there any openness in the M&R to, say, establish some regional distribution centers like Lakehead and maybe northeastern Ontario and one in central, where folks from this area could come with hard drives so we're not shipping it everywhere, and then delivering not the raw data if that's not what they need. A lot of users just want pyramided 8-bit versions that'll just work. The fact that everyone that touches the data has to regenerate pyramids, it's a time-intensive challenge, and then whether they have the capacity to step it down from 16-bit to 8-bit. So delivering data products instead of just the raw data, is that a consideration? And then another idea, because I'll take advantage of throwing out our R&D ideas and all that, is surveying the different companies that just went through 10 years and asking them, how did you approach this? What did you learn, and what would you maybe suggest? And is there any willingness to have a forum with just the interpreter companies? I don't know if they're willing to talk to one another and give away the trade secrets, but what worked, what didn't? I know some companies have their senior people draw the lines and then the juniors fill it in. That at least mitigates some of the challenges around if a junior person screws up the line work, it has larger impacts, but if they screw up the attribution, you can fix that. So that's a neat idea that you can potentially spread around so that everybody learns and everybody improves. Just another one.
So yes.
Excellent.
So we're to do a technical committee and a user group. So I've done the terms of reference for the user group. So the user group is intended to be academic, all the contractors, SFL, and ministry. And basically, similar to the provincial forest analysis meetings, try and do like a yearly meeting where you can bring in vendors, you can bring Esri in, or you can bring limb geomatics, you know what I mean? Like things like that where we can start to look at how you pull that data in, how you process it, how you can integrate that into your business process to help you redo the line work or do some pieces of the automation or attribution. So yeah, I don't know about the regional distributions. I haven't really talked about that. We've been more talking of trying to push those products to a cloud environment, and then basically try and go with clients being the SFL holders and regions like direct clients can just pull stuff off and on that from that platform. Maybe there's some opportunities to run analysis on that, but they can run it in the cloud environment and then just pull their rasters off. And then stakeholders maybe get 5 free ones, and then after that they got to pay a license fee to do those analysis, and then public just pulls and does a fee for service. So that's been more the model we've talked about, but I think we're open to a regional distribution piece as well. Like it doesn't really matter to us as long as we're getting the data is really our key thing in terms of how we're being evaluated. I'm definitely open for suggestions on the tech committee and the user group. Once I can get that term of reference approved, then I could send it out. I don't know if I put it to the advisory committee first or what I do, but anyway, I'll figure that out and I'll get it out to everybody and see what kind of participation we can get. Because that has also been something with FRI, with the FFT and the knowledge tool transfer team, like it's putting this on. We've tried to do sessions, and some have been well attended and some haven't, and we kind of went into a lull because we just weren't really getting much attendance for some of the sessions we were holding. So, you're trying to do the evaluation as to whether or not the sessions that you're putting on are worth anything, whether your focus is wrong or the timing of it is wrong. And the more you start to talk to people and you're planning your post-inventory meetings, you find out like, okay, ARs are due here, so don't touch me within the next 3 months. And then really your windows are the first week of July and then maybe January 3rd week, and then that's it. If you can't fit it in there, don't do it. So anyway, we have to do a better job at that, and
There is one more down here, and I think we'll have to
okay.
wrap up.
It's just really a question. You don't have to answer it. So it's been haunting me for quite a while, and it really seems to be prevailing over this room based on my one day in Ontario, so thank you for having me. The question is, first of all, how much are you spending on inventory currently, and how much is an inventory worth? And on the valuation question, it's how much is industry spending to compensate for the quality of the inventory to get to a place where they need to be, and how much opportunity has been lost because they still can't quite get there. And it seems to me that we have a really hard time making a case for funding inventories, funding ground plots, funding the R&D, particularly as I hear about the situation in Ontario. I guess the growth and yield component, which is at least as big as the inventory itself. So maybe for you folks, one of the questions that you might try to address is something along those lines, just an idea.
Yes, again.
Not many of them, but none of them are good enough as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, I was going to say.
Yeah, so obviously I'm, heavily influenced by where I come from. None of the provinces have made a good link between the inventory and the growth and yield, and yet the growth and yield piece is at least as big. So in designing an inventory, one has to be really focused on how those pieces fit. So in British Columbia, we use VDYP. People are very proud of it. It's been there for a long time. But to be honest, what it says is trees grow up and out. And we get that, but it's really hard to make decisions about, trying to get the right log to the right mill and trying to do the right thing with the product profile that we have. It's completely lost in the thing. So when we go to buy a piece of property or another outfit, I know we've been out here doing the same, we jump in helicopters, drive along roads, take a look, maybe put some ground plots in because we feel better about that. We'll put 100 in, be a big day, and make some inference about what the inventory is worth. Most mills aren't worth much. All the value is pretty much in the inventory. I think that, as Canadians, as provinces, as people who want to run a competitive forestry business, as people who are concerned about environmental protections, honestly, I don't know how we get this stuff right with an inventory that it doesn't tell us more explicitly where to do what. So I guess that's where I go with it. So I guess the short answer is nobody.
Well, with that concluding assessment, thank you very much. I think we'll pull the curtains on today's session. Certainly, the Forest Futures Trust Committee would be interested in any comments that anybody would like to address to us by email or in writing or whatever. Give us a call, and we can use such comments and intercede with the experts from FRI and maybe move some more yardsticks and hopefully a mountain or two somewhere in the future. It's been a good it's been 24 hours. It's been exceedingly refreshing to get out on the front end of some of this stuff. A little bit scary, particularly because I don't understand at least half the terminology that's been floating around this room today. I'm getting kind of old. And I'm really impressed at the people who've been up here at the podium and who are out there moving yardsticks today. So in closing this, I thank you all for coming. If we do take another round, we will do another of these maybe in a couple years' time. But with that, lunch is served up here at the at my left, and you're free to stay. The committee has a meeting in this room immediately after lunch, and that's about it. So thank you all. It's been a good day.